Some people who came down with COVID way back at the onset of the pandemic in 2020 are still suffering with debilitating symptoms 4 years later. Brain fog, chronic fatigue, sleep problems, depression, and anxiety are all hallmarks of long COVID. It's something MIT researcher Dr. Mikki Tal believes is a lot like chronic Lyme disease, which affects roughly 5 to 20% of people with the infection. Dr. Tal joins me now to discuss the link and why it matters. She's an immunoengineer and the principal scientist of MIT's Department of Biological Engineering. Mikki, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, chronic Lyme disease and long COVID are certain diseases that, some people don't argue that they don't even exist.
Yeah.
And you've managed to find not just sort of evidence that they exist, but an explanation for what's happening here. Tell us what that is.
So what we're really trying to dive into is from the earliest stages of the immune response to an infection, how early can we tell apart which way you're going? Are you going in a direction that your immune response is going to make a protective response? This is going to be a nothing infection. It might briefly disturb you, but you're never going to have to worry about it again once you're over it, versus people who are going in a trajectory where the immune system is essentially bringing the house down. A catastrophic immune response that is not only not protective, it is essentially triggering processes that are going to result in debilitating illness. And there are features that we can see that are different that we can measure that are happening in people going one direction versus another.
So what you're saying is that both of these diseases, they're maybe not so much about the virus or the bacteria anymore. They're about the way your body is responding to it. Kind of like lupus or psoriasis, which are autoimmune diseases too.
So it's one of our biggest questions. There are so many similarities between somebody who had Lyme and didn't recover and somebody who had COVID who didn't recover, and one's caused by a bacteria and one's caused by a virus. And so what we're trying to understand between the similarities and the differences is, does it matter which pathogen took you there? If, let's think about it as roads to Rome. There's many roads to Rome, right? But once you're in Rome, does it matter how you got to Rome in terms of bringing you back out from Rome? So is this a matter of tipping your immune system back towards making a protective response, or do we still need to treat that original infection that took you there?
So if you can tell when someone gets affected, if they're more likely to end up in one category or the other, that tells us essentially that it's real, that there is a real biological factor that's driving these phenomena.
There is a real biological factor that is driving these phenomena. These are very real diseases.
So who is more likely to end up with long COVID or with chronic Lyme?
So unfortunately, some of the things that are, triggering increased vulnerability to these illnesses are, there are certain biological factors that we know about. One of them is that there's a tremendous sex skew. So for both chronic Lyme and long COVID, it skews about 70-30 females to males.
So why is that?
Well, there are some really important differences in the immune response to infection between males and females. Some of this we think is chromosomal. So there's an XX chromosome versus an XY chromosome, and there's some important immune genes on the X chromosome where we have 2 copies. But other things that we've come to realize are really important are actually levels of the sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, as well as many other differences between male and female immune responses to infection that we don't really understand because we haven't been asking the right questions. A lot of what we understand about the immune response to infection, we understand about the male immune response to infection.
So as you're studying these gender differences, it seems like that means that there are lots of other areas, if our immune systems are so different, where men and women are likely to have different responses to disease or to medical interventions.
Profoundly different, yes.
So what else have you found?
Well, so, there are many different aspects where we have looked across the population at an average. And within that average, we've lost the resolution of some really key differences between us. So, for example, if you think about a height average, if you asked in the United States, what's the average height of somebody, the answer would be 5'7". But actually, you don't have that many people who are exactly 5'7". You actually have two major peaks around 5'4" and 5'10". And so by asking these questions at a population level average, we actually have lost some really important resolution on key differences between us that drive immune responses and also drive other responses that impact our health.
So because we're not all the same, if too many of our scientific studies treat us like we are, we're starting to lose detail and granularity about how to treat different people differently instead of all the same.
Exactly.
And my understanding is that you've particularly found that with vaccine dosages. So, like, I just, when my wife and I both first got the COVID vaccine, she essentially was in bed for 2 days, and I was tired for a day. And that was that a gender difference that drove that?
So, this is something that we're really trying to understand, and this is somewhere where we need to challenge an assumption that has, I think, been to our great detriment. So there's been this longstanding assumption that women are more likely to report adverse events, an assumption that led us to not properly investigate biological mechanisms that could be driving these adverse events that are fundamentally different between males and females. And part of what this comes down to is actually differences in dosages, that we're all being given a one-size-fits-all dose, where it's possible that we could really benefit from more catered doses that suit differences in our immune response.
So the vaccines are effective for everyone and they're safe for everyone, but if the dosages were varied, it might be possible that women would be less likely to have the severe side effects that they sometimes do when they first get the vaccine.
That's right. So what we see is that across different vaccination types, women often could be protected with a lower dose than men require to be protected, and therefore are in a one-size-fits-all situation, are being given a higher dose than they might require, and therefore potentially also having more adverse events or more side effects, as we would think of them, than maybe they needed to have if they could get a dose that was more properly suited.
Mikki, I think it's really exciting to know that we're you right here in Boston are helping us to transform our understanding of how people's bodies react to these things, and maybe someday we'll be able to tell people that we had you on before you cured chronic Lyme disease. So thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.